Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the AFPHM webinar. Today we have Professor Charles Watson from the Health Science Department of Curtin University in WA, who will be speaking on the topic of gun violence in Australia. Throughout the presentation, may I kindly remind you all to mute your microphone. Should you have any questions at any time, please type them in the chat function located in the group chat on the right-hand side of your screen. You can activate on the tab at the bottom of your screen, second icon from the left. There will be Q&A time following the presentation, in which everyone is welcome to unmute their microphones and ask questions or simply have a discussion. I'll hand it over to you, Professor Watson, for your presentation. Thank you.
After Port Arthur are being watered down in Australia, and so we're in danger of slipping back to where we might have been. So I'll take you through this. Gun massacres actually aren't unusual in Australia. Back in the 19th century, there were dozens of massacres. It's hard to judge the exact number of Aboriginal people killed. They were part of what was called the frontier wars at the time, but there were a number of massacres in which 100 or more Aboriginal people were killed at the one time. So that the idea of shooting lots of people was actually pretty popular in the 19th century. It faded out, and after Federation, mass shootings were less common, but they still occurred until about 1930 in WA, Queensland and Northern Territory. Now, as far as Australia is concerned, when you look at where we're at, we have a firearm death rate of 30 per million, which is not nearly as good as England and Wales, which is only 4 per million, and of course much less than the United States, which is 154 per million. And before Port Arthur, there were about 600 firearm deaths a year, which is 1 in 13 of all injury deaths. 80% of them were suicides, and that still exists. Handguns have been strictly controlled in general in Australia, although we could do with more regulation to do with that, and they don't cause very many of the deaths overall. But ownership of rifles and shotguns was high before Port Arthur, about 4 million guns in a population of 18 million at that time. So what happened at Port Arthur was that a young man, Martin Bryant, who'd walked into a shop a couple of times in the previous few weeks and bought an AR-10 and an AR-15 military-style semi-automatic rifle. He killed 35 people and wounded 23 others. Of course, the sort of rifle, the AR-15, called the Bushmaster, is rapid fire with Armalite bullets in it, which means that when the bullet hits you, it doesn't just make a hole; it flattens out to cause an excavation, something about the size of a small plate. So if you hit pretty well anywhere above the shoulder or the shoulder above, you die. So he fired about 20 shots in less than half a minute, killed 12 and 10 others. And he went outside, shot more people outside, including when he tried to drive away from the place. He encountered Walter Mikac with his wife and 2 daughters, whom he shot. Now, after the event, it was claimed that Bryant was schizophrenic quite a bit. I actually thought that was true at the time. He did have a lower than average IQ, but there was no evidence ever from a psychiatrist that he was actually suffering from a psychotic illness. And at the time, there was no registration of gun owners in Tasmania, so he just walked into the shop and bought them. There was no criminal record check, no anything actually. And there was a lot of outrage, but really the only group to successfully raise the gun ownership issue was what was then called the Coalition for Gun Control. I'll talk a little bit more about that afterwards. So what was a crucial thing that happened was that Howard was newly elected, and the Australian Police Ministers' Council was coming up a couple of weeks after Port Arthur, and he at that time managed to convince the states and territories they should sign up to a new national firearms agreement. In fact, he was tough. Some states said that they didn't want to do it, and he said that if they wanted to break away, he'd simply introduce national laws instead of leaving it to state and territory control. The responses generally are quite interesting. As I've said here, there are predictable condemnation, sympathy for the bereaved, hopes it will never be repeated, all the things they say in America every time there's a tragedy. And then it says, these ritual lamentations felt short of specific commitments to gun law that might have upset the shooting constituency, and until Howard stepped in, nothing was actually going to happen. The public response, however, was massive, and polls immediately after it indicate about 90% of people wanted tough gun laws. In fact, they still do. It's amazing that the pro-gun lobby has such a loud voice, considering that so many of the people really want tight control of guns, and they want a total ban on semi-automatics. At the time, pretty much every radio and television print media commentator gave strong support. Even the right-wing people, I'm not sure whether Jones was involved at that time, but people of his ilk, Howard Adler in Western Australia, for example, really jumped straight in to give support for the Prime Minister's position, which made a lot of difference in terms of the politicians' willingness to go along with the Prime Minister. Interestingly enough, when you look at what medical and public health bodies did, there were only two. There were the Coalition for Gun Control and the Australian Medical Association, who made a statement and, in fact, helped by attending one of the major rallies that we held at the time. Not a single health department uttered a peep, and no other public health body made any comment at all, which was probably as much made due to lack of expertise as well as it was to political compromise. The Coalition for Gun Control had existed for a couple of years before Port Arthur, had been trying to do something about gun laws, but made absolutely no impact at all because of the power of the gun lobby. But Rebecca Peters, most importantly, had done a lot of research on the relevant laws in the Australian states and territories, and she had a large poster which was a detailed table of what was going on in each state and territory and what had to be done after Port Arthur. And this took probably 6 months to a year to develop, but was absolutely crucial in the weeks after Port Arthur because it gave Howard and others essentially a recipe for what they had to do. The Coalition for Gun Control doesn't exist now. It's now called Gun Control Australia, which I'll talk about later on. And the Coalition for Gun Control at the time did a lot in the first 4 or 5 days, put out press releases, did lots of radio and press interviews. We had the advantage that Rebecca Peters was very experienced at media. She used to produce Andrew Denton. She knew a lot of media people and got on every possible radio show. And a number of volunteers came into an ad hoc communications centre where Sydney University gave us a room, which was generally known as the bunker. The publications organised, and we scheduled a rally for the Saturday after that, which put a lot of pressure on the politicians who were looking at what was going on. And in fact, we went to see Peter Collins on the Thursday, who was leader of the opposition, and after a short discussion, he thought it was a good idea and he signed everything we wanted. And so we went to Premier Bob Carr, who was in the office down the hall, and convinced him for the first time to sign up too. That was crucial because it gave Howard all the states except Queensland willing to support. What happened at the police ministers' meeting was the adoption of what's called the National Firearms Agreement, and it covers pretty much all the important things that Rebecca Peters had raised in her poster. A ban on semi-automatic and self-loading long guns, that's pump-action shotguns, a buyback of semi-automatic guns, and then new laws which were supposed to be reflecting the needs of the National Firearms Agreement. It took a while to get them all passed, but by mid-1998 they were pretty much all through. And there was a national licensing and gun registration system, need for a genuine reason to have a gun. You couldn't just say you wanted it for self-defence, and these other issues, criminal record check, 28-day waiting period, restriction on domestic violence offenders, etc., and safe storage requirements, which are extremely important. So the situation was pretty good with the National Firearms Agreement. The buyback was very important because 660 approximately newly prohibited guns were bought back at the market value, and large criminal penalties were introduced for the possession of such weapons. Despite this, quite a few gun owners we know hid or buried their prohibited weapons, and they still have them there, and some of these float onto the market from time to time, what's generally referred to as the grey market for hidden guns. The situation now is this, that we're back to the same number of registered guns pretty much as we had around about the time of Port Arthur, which you may think is a bit of a worry, but to moderate that, you've got to say that, first of all, the population's a lot bigger now, so per million it's probably not as many, and secondly, that the guns which have been added on since then are not semi-automatics or pump-action shotguns. There are 730,000 licence holders, mostly Category A, and there are 4 categories, and the only ones you really got to know about is Category A is a normal hunting licence that enables you to have something like a .22 rifle which you shoot rabbits with, or a single or double shotgun, the sort of ordinary hunting rifles that people would have. Category C and D are the serious categories which allow you to have a semi-automatic weapon, and they're very hard to get into those. One of the problems that's been happening over the past 15 years is that despite the registration requirements, individual gun owners who register as an owner once can continue to buy weapons in most states. And we know some who've actually got 300 registered weapons. These are not collectors, but they're in a different category. These are people who just want to have 300 guns in their house, which we think is a considerable difficulty. When you move on to what's actually happened, the most important thing is that before Port Arthur, the 18 years, there were 12 mass fatal shootings. That's more than 5 people killed in each. And since Port Arthur, there hasn't been a mass fatal shooting. Now, that might have been partly good luck, but we do attribute that to the absence of semi-automatics and pump-action guns out there. I think it has been a major difference. When you look at the shooting deaths per year since then, there has been a huge difference. It's dropped from 600 down to 230. Of course, of these, the majority are suicides, a small number of homicides, some unintentional deaths, and 18 still unclassified. It's interesting that of the homicides, nearly half of them are classified as domestic, and half of those are intimate partners. The whole reason that Rebecca Peters got into the gun homicide area was that as a law student she was studying deaths in wives, and she found out that a lot of them were being shot. They were killed by other means as well, but shooting was a common way to get rid of intimate partners over that time, and it still is. So it's interesting in the next slide to compare it with motor vehicle deaths. They've also dropped by a huge amount, from nearly 4,000 down to just over 1,200 in 2015. That's over a rather longer period. I think it's interesting because the way in which the motor vehicle deaths have been reduced is by a huge program across Australia of legislation and regulation, with strict enforcement by police and public communication. There have been television ads and things of that kind to get people incorporated. So in some ways it does have some parallels to the gun issue, and that is that guns are lethal under all circumstances, just as cars are, but if you can restrict the ways in which they're used and make their usage safer, which we try to do with guns, you can actually make a big difference. The recent paper by Simon Chapman and Alpers and Jones is extremely important, because if you want to have a single source of authority for what's actually happened in Australia, this article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association just last month has been enormously influential. Around the world, more than 70 news outlets have adopted coverage of it, and it's already in the top 3% of all JAM articles of all time in terms of attracting not medial interest, and it's rising. That's only after a single month. So, of course, one of the reasons you might say, why would this be so important? And that is that in America, there's very little to publish about research on gun violence, because nearly all funding for gun violence research has been stopped. The NRA, through the Republican Party, simply threatens to close down any organisation that tries to do it, and no federal grants are awarded for any such research. So that very little gun violence research comes out of America. There is a bit funded by the universities themselves, but there's not very much. And so an article like this is seen to be very, very important on the US scene, as well as the rest of the international scene. I'll just summarise some of the findings in the Simon Chapman article. The numbers get a little complicated to look at, but I've highlighted them red to show the important ones. And that is that, very importantly, the annual shooting rates have dropped from 3.9 to 1.3 per 100,000 annually from 79 to 2013, which is good. And the suicide rates fell from 3 to 0.99, and the homicide rates from 0.57 to 0.20. And despite claims to the contrary, there's no evidence for a substitution effect for the use of non-firearm means in suicide and homicide. People say, oh, you know, people will just suicide by some other means. They'll stab themselves or jump off cliffs or whatever. It turns out they don't. Guns provide a particular risk for suicide and homicide, because once you decide to grab them and do something with them, the results are absolutely predictable. People die immediately after it. Whereas if you have to seek some other means to suicide, like try and get some tablets from someone or other and then find an opportunity to take them, that kind of thing, it diffuses the situation somewhat. And it's the same with homicide. So that's the summary of those things. I want to get on to issues at the moment, particularly relating to this new import which is allowed, the Adler shotgun, which is a major issue for Australian gun control at the present time. Made in Turkey. It's been passed off as, oh, just another shotgun. We've had shotguns for a long while, but it's not true. That large oval thing behind the trigger is a lever action slot where you put your hand into, and you just click it up and down, and it loads an extra cartridge in. It's very fast. You can rip off under 1 shot per second with this gun, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. The basic Adler has a 5-shot magazine, and then you have 1 shot in the breech, so you've got 6 shots overall. But you can extend the capacity of this and the other Adler models with a do-it-yourself kit. You can buy these from an Australian company online, and in every state except New South Wales, it's legal to do so. And you just screw it onto the original gun, and you end up with 14 shots instead of the original 5 or 6. There have been 7,000 Adlers sold already since last year. It came in August 2015, and it was a bit of a shock because Tony Abbott had put this on the back burner. He was not happy about the application for importation, but one day they needed Leon Helm's vote in the Senate, and so they asked him what he wanted, and he obviously wanted this, and they immediately approved the importation, which is a tragedy. And the thing is that this is available to all Category A licence holders. These are your standard hunting shooters who've normally got 22s for shooting rabbits or whatever. The gun only costs $850, and the sort of upgraded model, the 7.1, is still awaiting approval, but that doesn't really matter all that much. The 5.1 with the magazine extension is dangerous enough already. Now, as well as the Adler importation, there are serious worries around the states and territories about the erosion of gun laws. In many states, I know in WA, minors can have access to guns. You can any age from 0 up can shoot a gun in Western Australia. New South Wales has just allowed hunting with guns in national parks. There's access to silencers for recreational shooters in New South Wales, and there's continued to be this problem that registered shooters, once they register that they're a legal person able to buy a gun, they just give that as the reason next time and next time and next time, and that's how they accumulate anything between 200 and 300 guns. And currently, in the various states, the 28-day waiting period is under threat. And this is only a short summary of a lot of changes which have occurred in all the jurisdictions in Australia. It's been a progressive issue ever since Port Arthur. And you might say, why did things go so bad? Well, the first is that most people don't know anything about this. People I talk to say, but haven't we got the National Firearms Agreement? Isn't everything okay? They don't realise that things have been deteriorating quite badly and they are not still okay. The second is the rise in the power of the gun lobby. They are ferocious and cashed up. One of the reasons they're cashed up is that they've really probably following the NRA examples in the United States. They've progressively taken over small gun clubs, which are kind of small, not specifically politically oriented groups, and they've bullied people out of leadership positions and taken over those. I think this will be exposed sometime soon. It's quite a big story. But what they do then, of course, is put up the gun club membership rates and basically draw in cash from all of the gun clubs. So they've got parliamentary representation in a number of the states, and they've got the Leon-Helm party in the federal Senate. So it's very difficult because in various of the states, the government in power may need these extra votes in the upper house in order to pass legislation that they want, and so doing deals with the shooters and fishers, or whichever party they're called, has been a fairly common thing. Governments and politicians haven't really paid any specific interest to this. Howard has continued to make statements from time to time, which has been great. I think Howard quite properly sees it as probably the best thing that he did when he was Prime Minister. So some people would claim it's probably the only thing that he did while he was Prime Minister, but that's maybe a bit harsh. But he certainly is proud of that, and he's continued to assist with speaking on particular occasions. It's interesting that when you read the blogs and things by the shooters, that there's a series of mantras that they come out with. The first is that they hate the Gun Control Australia and all similar organisations because they want to ban all guns. They claim that most homicides are carried out by mentally ill people. They claim that it's really a problem with illicit guns being smuggled into Australia, that registered owners look after their guns and that's all right. And the other lie is that a gun at home makes your family safer. It's interesting to look at these individually. The first thing, do we want to ban all guns? And the answer is absolutely no. What we want is safer gun ownership. It's a bit like we didn't approach the motor vehicle death rate by saying we wanted to ban cars. We said we wanted safer car ownership and management, and that's exactly what's happened. And sensible controls on gun purchases and licensing, transport and storage are what we're really after. And secondly, there is one strict thing. We don't want military weapons in the hands of community members. There might be some very specific reasons for people to have one or other of those weapons, but they'll go into category C or D in the licence arrangements and won't make an impact on the whole of the situation as far as Australia's concerned. Second is this issue of mental illness and gun crime. It is complicated But the first thing is that only around 3% of gun crimes are caused by people with mental illness. And the important thing is there's a very high, the third point there, there is a difference between what you call everyday shootings and massacres. I don't think there's any doubt that the involvement of mentally ill people in massacres is higher than in other, in everyday shootings in the United States, the sort of things that come up that they shoot about 10 people a day or something of that kind. These hardly ever involve people with mental illness, but people with mental illness occasionally, like the guy who stabbed people in Japan just a few days ago, and the people and Bryant himself, while he didn't have schizophrenia, I don't think he'd be considered to be a stable person, and so I think that it's a bit complicated, but to argue that mental illness is a major cause of gun crimes is still rubbish. In some categories they'll be more represented. The interesting thing is that mentally ill people are much more often shot than non-mentally ill people, mainly due to suicide, but quite often when when their behaviour is of concern to police, the police shoot them just in case, as has happened in Sydney a few times lately. There's an article there by Fazell and Grand down below from the American Journal of Psychiatry, which has quite a thoughtful discussion of the mental illness issue, and it does prove to be a lot. It's not a sort of one-liner. It's a rather more complicated issue to address. The second is that this thing is that if you want to defend yourself, you should have a gun at home. Well, the real answer is that for every time a gun, this is a Kellerman et al. Article that I've cited below, in the United States. They looked at official records in Seattle, Memphis and Galveston in the United States, and they found that for every time a gun was used in self-defense against an intruder, there were 4 unintentional shootings, 7 criminal assaults or homicides, that is shooting another member of the family, or the intruder grabbing the gun from you and shooting you, and 11 attempted or completed suicides. In other words, it's disastrous statistically having a gun at home. It increases the risk of death for you or your family members by a very considerable amount. I mean, it turns out that that you're more likely to be shot by your children for the unintentional shootings than you are by an intruder under any circumstance. So that's quite important. The problem with this research is that there's been very little to follow this up because of the withdrawal of funding for gun violence research in the United States. I recall back in about 1997, I think it was, when the Republicans took over the lower house, there was quite a significant gun violence group in the Centers for Disease Control, and what they did was they simply went to the Centers for Disease Control and they said, you either close down the gun violence group or we will arrange to close down the whole of the Centers for Disease Control. And so I knew the guy who was running that group at the time. He was approached by the director and he said, I'm sorry, we're sacking all of you because otherwise the whole lot of us go. And that's exactly what happened. So the NRA in the United States have just enormous power, and of course it's interesting, they've aligned themselves very closely with Trump, absolutely backing him, and Trump has decided to absolutely back the NRA, which may rebound against them if Trump loses, but of course if Trump wins it'll be a disaster. Okay, the next is the illicit gun issue, which is quite interesting. The gun lobby often try to say, oh no, look, the real problem is there are these bad people smuggling illegal guns into Australia, and that's why we have such a criminal gun issue. It isn't true. 99% of the guns in the illicit market in Australia have been previously legally owned guns that were transferred into the illicit market, either because they were stolen or by illegal sales, sort of backdoor sales. In actual fact, illegal gun importation, you'll be pleased to know, is very tightly monitored in Australia at present. The new system that Australia Post have, working with Border Control, can actually pick up small components of guns, because what was happening at one time was that people would take a Glock pistol and break it down into 20 little bits and send them in separate packages. Well, the new system is very, very clever and can pick up those small amounts. If they pick up a single part of a gun, they watch for the pickup of the parcel and they arrest the people concerned. So gun importation is almost gun smuggling is almost non-existent in Australia at the present time. It's interesting, some people raise the point, say, but couldn't they smuggle in plastic guns which would not be picked up by the metal detecting scanning that the post office do? Well, Philip Alpers tells me that the whole plastic gun thing is what he describes as, it's like Kentucky Fried Rat. It's one of these urban myths that has been spread about, but actually it's nonsense, and there are no effective 3D printer or plastic guns which are available, and they are not a significant issue in importation at all. It's just one of those things that's raised without people realising how humorous it is. And so here's where I want to get to the sort of heart of the public health thing with this. This is my favourite list of all the things that public health people can do to address any public health issue. You'll note at the bottom there's my favourite mnemonic here, which you remember the first letter of each of these on the list by Real Men Eats Pizza and Chips, New Age Thinking Ladies Prefer Fried Eggs, and it simply gives you the first letter in the list as a prompt if you're struggling to do this in a talk. And I've bolded the ones which I think are appropriate in this case. And I'll talk more about those in the next session. But the nice thing about this list is that you can apply it whether you're talking about HIV/AIDS or smoking or motor vehicle deaths or whatever. That these are essentially all of the weapons, all the strategies that we have available to us to address any new public health issue. So if we go to the next slide. What ones could we use selected out of those? Well, obviously, I'm sorry, I've just got my phone going and I'll just turn it off and then turn it off again. There we are. Sorry about that. That ongoing support for legislative strength to ensure safe gun ownership, public and professional education. I think for various reasons the public have lost track of this whole thing, and we should take all opportunities that there are to get information out to the public. And of course, doctors, and particularly public health doctors, ought to be well informed on this issue. Individuals can advocate both by themselves, by writing letters to politicians and all that sort of thing, and through credible organisations. There are, of course, a number of other issues about gun violence that relate to the kind of people that are likely to perpetrate such violence, and that is that a significant amount of predilection to violence overall starts off with children, and programs that enhance early attachment reduce the incidence of violence in those people when they grow up. The children that grow up in awful circumstances, particularly when there's a lot of violence in the home, actually undergo gene shifts at that time, which they don't ever recover from. And there's been a good deal of research in that direction. I'll talk about that just a little bit more. In the United States, lead exposure to children has been an enormous contributor, even if you misspell children, as I've done there. It was found that when the Clean Air Act was introduced in 1971, it led 25 years later to a very significant reduction in violence in inner-city ghetto communities. They reckon 40% reduction of violence was actually due to taking lead out of the atmosphere. The paper by Rays, I can give you the other details of that, is very interesting in this regard. And then, of course, the whole point is about predilection to violence, is that if you're in Australia and New Zealand and you have a predilection for violence, mostly you'll punch someone or hit them. At very worst, you may pull out a knife. But in the United States, of course, with access to guns, people who get angry and aggressive shoot people, and so that there is a real difference in consequences. Of course, suicide being such an important cause of gun death, suicide prevention programs are important, and looking into domestic violence situations is important as well. And of course, research and monitoring ongoing are absolutely crucial to keeping up with our understanding of what's really going on out there. So I just want to refer here to the issue of predilection to aggression and gun use. You may have seen on television recently a series on the Dunedin longitudinal study. This is a very, very important study involving 1,000 people, and the wonderful thing about it is that it's been able to maintain connection with the people that they've studied at about the 95% level from birth right up to adulthood. So it's really the gold standard internationally for looking at personality development and its later consequences. One of the things that it found, just one small thing really, was that about 5% of males are responsible for 50% of crimes committed by males, and they had one or mainly one, but one or two personality types. And so they looked at males in Pittsburgh in the United States. Pittsburgh's also misspelled, should have an H on the end. And interesting enough, the percentage of criminality, in fact, the distribution of the personality types was just about exactly the same as in Dunedin. And they looked particularly at the percentage of assault charges on the people in the study, and it was pretty much the same. But of course, if you commit an assault in Pittsburgh, you're more likely to shoot them, and in Dunedin it's extremely unlikely. So it's an interesting thing. It shows that it's not innate aggression in the United States which makes people more likely to kill people with guns. It's simply the fact that they have access to guns. So I think if you haven't looked at much at the Dunedin study, it's got lots of very, very interesting aspects, and this is just one little sliver of all of that's there. So what can you do? My last slide. And keep well informed. I mean, some of that is by watching stuff that comes out through the news. If you support Gun Control Australia, that'd be terrific. But even not, go into their website, which we're actually revamping at the moment, and that can give you good information. And raise the subject amongst your colleagues and friends. Find out if they know anything about the Adler. The reason that the Adler issue is so important at the moment is that the COAG agreement, the COAG meeting in late August or early September will actually discuss the National Firearms Agreement, and they'll discuss whether they should ban the Adler or whether they should just ban the magazine extension kits. And it's very much up for grabs at the moment. And if you feel like doing so, writing to Michael Keenan or to the State Minister for Police would be a good thing. So that's all from me, guys. I think we're going to throw it open for any questions from you. And if you want to find out any more about Gun Control Australia or other lobbying activities, I'd be delighted to respond to you if you email me. I'm at c.watson@curtin, curtin.edu.au. So I'd be pleased to hear from you. Chantel, what do you do now? Oh.
Okay. Are there any questions or comments? All the microphones are unmuted at the moment. Or you can type
I can unmute. Yep.
What we could do is have everyone unblock their their cameras, just so Mr. Watson can see who's joined in, because at the moment it looks like he's just talking to himself.
It does.
So we could get everyone to jump on board and just show us your faces and see who's joined in for today's session. That'd be great. anyone have any questions, any comments at all? If you do, after today's session, feel free to email them to Professor Watson directly, or you could email them to afphm@racp.edu.au.
Yep.
That concludes today's webinar. Many thanks to Professor Charles Watson for presenting a great talk today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal.
For connected in today's session as well. Should you think of anything else other than that, you can email afphm or events@racp.edu.au. Otherwise, we hope to see you next time.
Thanks, Chantal.
Thank you.